Well, hello, welcome to this episode of Coroner Talk, the only podcast in iTunes and all of your other podcast directories dedicated to the men and women serving the field of death investigation. Coroners, medical examiners, police officers, all the supporting roles around that. I want to welcome each and every one of you to today's episode. What we're going to talk about today is suicide. We're going to talk about the preponderance of evidence. What is the definition of suicide? What are some statistics around it? And what does it take to actually rule a death as suicide? You know, is it 50%, a 70% assurance? How do we come up with that? And there's a lot of things here we're going to point out that's very interesting, that you may be looking at suicide cases a little differently than you did before. They're not always as straightforward and as easy just to rule it a suicide. Now, this is part of an online training that we have done. It's all new suicide and self-harm online course. We've totally revamped it, and these are excerpts of that course. It's me teaching the course, and it's excerpts of that course. And we're going to finish up on our next episode with another bit of that as well, because these are great topics. And although they're video trainings, the portions that I'm sharing are great in audio form, and you're going to learn a lot. And for those of you that's been around a while, I know that you see my absence. I know you know that I've been gone. We're going to change some things around, make it easier to be consistent with our shows. I've been traveling a lot. Of course, most of you know as well that last year, I became, rather than deputy coroner, I'm now the elected coroner. We've got a lot of regional stuff going on, building a new morgue. So between traveling, between the coroner's office and running the academy as a whole, yeah, well, I'm out of excuses. But that's kind of where I've been. That's kind of what's been going on. But I'm telling you, I'm trying the best I can to get back on track. I see you at conferences. I see you at trainings. You come up to me and you say, hey, I love the podcast. When are you going to get back on track? When we're going to have a new episode? I see you. I hear you. And I appreciate you doing that. Don't stop doing that. I'm going to do everything I can to get back on track. And your support, your emails, your coming up to my table, coming up after training on breaks and talking to me about the podcast certainly helps me understand that there is a listener base out there and you are interested in this type of training. So please continue to do that. So without any further delay, let's get into this portion of that training on suicide classifications.
Adjust your earbuds, turn up those speakers, and hang on. It's now time for this week's featured conversation.
All right, welcome. Today we're going to be talking about suicide and self-harm death. We're going to spend a lot of time in this course just specifically talking about suicide. And one of the reasons why a course like this is important, now if you're on the coroner side, if you're a coroner, medical examiner, you're going to see every death in your jurisdiction, whether it be homicide, suicide, infant death, natural causes, hospice cases. You're going to be involved in all of those. But as a police officer, if you're coming to this course as an officer, police officer, detective, deputy sheriff, something like that, you're probably going to work suicide cases more so than anything else, because luckily we don't have that many homicides in smaller jurisdictions. We don't have that many baby deaths. And even when you do have homicides, you know, you've got a patrol officer arrive, but you've got detectives coming to that. But, you know, they're not everywhere every day. And so you're not going to be working on natural causes, death, things like that, but you will be working suicides. And so those are cases you go to where all of a sudden you have something that looks to be like a death by suicide, and you have to then start working the investigation. Now, this is what we're going to concentrate on during this course, is what to look for in the scene, what to look for to determine whether or not this was death by suicide, and how to process the scene, how to investigate the mental health of the person, some ideations, victimology, we call it, things like that. So we're going to spend some time talking about taking a death that you believe could be death by suicide, and then all the steps it takes to process that and properly determine whether or not that was a death by suicide. And we're going to talk about several different methods of suicide, things like that, throughout this course. So let's get started. Okay, so every year in the United States, currently there's about 45,000, I think 45,979 is going to be the statistics from CDC. So 46,000 deaths per year of suicides. And that equates out to about 1 every 12 minutes. 1 every 12 minutes. And so even though there's a lot of jurisdictions in the United States, there's a lot of police officers in the United States, that's still a lot of death. And so you're going to see that. CDC says it's the 12th leading cause of death in the United States. Now, we know if we look at cause and manner, cause has to do with what actually causes the death, the mechanism. Suicide is actually a manner. But what CDC is trying to say is it's the 12th leading reason why people die, okay? And that used to be number 10. There's some other things take place, and it has been etched down now to 12. Still a very, very high percentage. And of course, men die at 3 to 3.5 times more than women. And white males account for 7 out of every 10 suicides is a white male. Now, this number has been growing. All these statistics have been growing over the last 12 years, and for several reasons. We just recently went through COVID, and so there's a lot of suicides increased during COVID because of lockdowns and things affecting people's mental health. Of course, we got financial concerns. We've got more marriage losses. We've got a lot of LGBT issues, which we'll talk about later in today. And because the suicide rates in that community is starting to grow. So there's a lot of reasons why suicides are increasing. And as such, you are going to be working suicides more than anything else. So let's look at these statistics here. The methods of suicide. Now, 51% is gunshot. And we'll talk a lot about gunshot later today. Gunshot suicides are going to be your number one number one cause of death. Gunshots, 51%. And then 29% is suffocation. Now that can be ligature strangulation, that can be bag over your head, some other form of oxygen occlusion, whether it be positional or something like that. But some type of suffocation, that's the next leading one. And of that, hanging is going to be the most popular. So gunshots the first, and then some type of suffocation. Within that group, hanging is going to be the most popular. 13% here is poisoning, and the 13% of poisoning has to do with drug overdoses, legal and illegal drug overdoses, on purpose to cause death. And then some of them also include just poisoning, just literally drinking something like sodium nitrite, which we'll talk about, some type of something to kill yourself. And that is a poisoning, okay? Even drinking antifreeze yourself. Something is a poisoning you. And then the 7% is other. Now, what is other? Well, jumping off of a highway bridge in front of a truck, walking down the road, jumping in front of a car, jumping off a bluff, jumping off a bridge, anything, driving your car off a cliff, something like that to cause your death. Now, suicide by cop, which you create a situation where you make a police officer shoot you because you're threatening their life or lives of others. That would fall into an other. Now, that is a death by a firearm, but the person who died by suicide is actually going to be a homicide death because it was a death by a other. So a police officer shot somebody, that by statute is going to be a homicide. Now, it could be a justified homicide, but it could be death by suicide by cop. We call it that because the person is intentionally doing something to make the policeman shoot them. So that's a little bit of a gray area, but that would be an other. That would not be considered a firearm death. And this graph here just shows that over the last several years, you can see the graph is moving up. Suicide rates, of course, are moving up in the United States. Now let's look at by race and ethnicity. This is very interesting. If you look at the top line there, that's going to be your American Indian and your Alaskan Native. The American Indian and Alaskan Native tribal lands have a very, very high rate of suicide. There's a lot of reasons for that. I've talked to a lot of officers that work tribal lands and things like that. And drinking and drugs, feeling of depression. There's just a lot of issues in tribal lands that these officers deal with, and they see a very high rate of suicide. And I think psychologically that'd be something that someone could weigh in on other than me as to why that occurs, but that is a valid statistic. And then below that, you'll see the yellow line, which is Caucasian. So Caucasian accounts for the next highest outside of Native American and Alaskan Native. So, and then the green line that you see there is all suicides combined. But here's what's interesting. When you get to the very bottom, that's where you see African American, Black, Latino, Asian, Pacificer. Those groups have a very low rate of suicide. So as officers, we need to, and as in coroner investigators, we need to think about statistics. So as we go through this course, we're going to talk a lot of areas where statistically it's valid or invalid to whether this can occur. So when you go to a scene that appears to be a suicide, you do work your investigation and you still have to have a preponderance of evidence. In a Native American situation, maybe you feel like it's a higher rate of suicide. Be careful that we don't have preconceived ideas. But then when you go down into like Black male, Black female, Asian, Latino, those suicide rates are very low. So it certainly isn't that they don't commit suicide. Obviously, they die by suicide, but it's low. So when we go to those cases, we want to be sure we think, now, wait a minute. I know statistically that an Asian female does not commit suicide. And an Asian male does not commit suicide. So is this, I'm already starting out with this very low preponderance of evidence. And so I have to investigate that a little further. So knowing those statistics help guide your investigation, not showing up with preconceived notion, but helps to guide the investigation. So know your statistics, watch your statistics on methods and race and ethnicity, and know that in your area, so that wherever area you work, you may be predominantly one culture or one race over another. And knowing those statistics in your area is going to help you work these investigations better than just kind of knowing a broad general sense. Okay, now let's define suicide. Now, suicide certainly has a very distinct and specific definition. And as investigators, we all have to play by these rules, okay? We can't be subjective in this. So let's look at this definition. A suicide is the act or instance of taking one's own life voluntarily and intentionally, especially by someone with years of discretion and sound mind. Okay, so with that, the last part of that is, if a 6-year-old commits suicide, you have to be able to prove they knew what they were doing. And we'll talk about adolescent and child suicide later today. But you have to be able to prove that they knew what they were doing. And someone of sound mind. You may not rule a suicide if you have someone that you know absolutely does not have the mental capacity to know what they were doing. Okay? But let's go back to everyone else. Voluntary and intentional. Now, this is where it trips people up. The act that they do has to be voluntary, meaning they did this act. They jumped off the bridge on purpose, and their intent was to die. Now, if they jumped off the bridge getting away from someone, or they jumped off the bridge because they were trying to show off, or they thought it was they were going to be able to go hit the water and swim away, and they were just showing how tough they were, then that's not suicide. The act has to be specifically to die. Okay? So regardless of how risky the behavior is, it's not suicide unless you can prove the person meant to die. So here there are 5 manners of death. Of course, suicide falls within one of those manners. Coroners and medical examiners is the one that assigns the manner. And of course, law enforcement assists with that. When it comes to manners of death, there's a degree of certainty. Now, this is has put out by the National Association of Medical Examiners, or NAME. And so this is their degrees of certainty. Undetermined means we have a dead person and we cannot determine the manner. We don't know if it's accident, homicide, suicide. We have to leave it undetermined. We just don't know. That is 50% certainty or below. That's below that. We don't know. We're like 30% sure it's probably a heart attack, but yet there's this and there. So uncertain, undetermined, less than 50%. If we have reasonable medical investigative probability, which is greater than a 50% chance, then we can rule it. Generally, that's going to be within a natural causes death. Could be accident as well. An accident, I like to think accident as more of a 55% chance that it was an accident. Just give you a little bit more percentage. And I'll explain these percentages more in a minute. And then preponderance of medical investigation evidence. Let's say about 70% or greater, meaning you have the preponderance of medical evidence and investigative evidence to prove that this was in fact something. I'm 70% sure or more that this was a natural cause heart attack. This was an accident, blunt force trauma from car accident. So whether natural or accident, your preponderance of evidence, you've got a lot of evidence, both medically and or investigatively, that you feel you're 70% more sure that it is this and nothing else. And then clear and convincing is 90%, meaning, by golly, I'm as sure as anybody could be. Then there's 100%, and there are times that you can get to 100%, but 100% is not always possible. So this graph here shows you that natural 50%. We have no other reason to believe that Grandpa didn't die of suicide. Nothing about the scene looks like homicide. Grandpa has heart problems. He only has like 40% of his heart function left. He's been shaking hands with the hereafter for the last few days, and he just didn't wake up this morning. And so it's 50% chance that it's suicide. Natural. We've got no other reason to believe it's anything else. We can rule that unnatural. Accident, I like to be a little bit more. I think 55% is best. Name says 50 to 55%, which would be, preponderance of the evidence would be 70, but clear and convincing would be 90. So suicide, we say 70%. That means we are 70% sure that it cannot be anything else. All right? Homicide, we want to be 90% sure. 90% sure that this person died at the hands of another. Absolutely no possibility it could be anything else, right? 90%. Now, how do we come up with these degrees of certainty? Well, they are a little bit subjective, and I'll give you an example of subjective here in just a moment. But they're a little bit subjective. So you say, well, suicide's 70%. Well, why ain't 68%? Well, what about 62? Well, what about 75 or 77? Well, that's numbers don't really matter. What this is trying to show is, because it's a little bit subjective, we want to be able to say 70%, whatever 70% means to you, okay? It means that it's way more than a happenstance at 50-50. You may not be 90%, in some cases you might be above 70 for sure, 90% of suicide, but you have to be at least 70% sure, and however that 70% means to you, but 70% sure, 75%, that the person voluntarily and intentionally did the act to cause their death. Now, that's a subjective number, but obviously the number shows that it's a high enough percentage that you need to be pretty sure. And then, of course, just the homicide rating, again, you have to be at least 90% sure, and in your report and your investigation, you feel like you could prove 90% or greater that that person died at the hands of another, okay? So suicide, 70% chance. Let's come back to that. So manners of death classifications should be objective. And they should be based upon established criteria, not only national criteria, but also maybe criteria in your agency, in your department. Things do vary across the United States as to degrees of certainty, okay? But nowhere should you ever base a manner classification because of political pressure, social pressure, whether your philosophy or agenda fights for it or against it. Manners of death should be ruled based upon medical and investigative findings only. No political pressure, nothing like that. I knew a coroner one time that got in pretty bad trouble because he was ruling, there were some families who, a person had died by suicide, 3 or 4 different families throughout his couple of years. And they did not want their family to be ruled suicide, partly insurance reasons. There's a lot of implications because of suicide. So the coroner would rule the death accident, sign out the death certificate as accident, and move on. even though the evidence showed that it was suicide. That's illegal, that's unethical, that's immoral. You can't do that, okay? It has to be based just specifically on the criteria as we have established. And of course, here's some, I mentioned just a second ago, some implications you may have with suicide rulings. Family denial. There's going to be families that do not like the fact that you're ruling it suicide. I deal with families all the time that they're just convinced and sure there's no way their son, their father, their mother would have ever committed suicide. Someone had to have killed them because they just wouldn't do that. Well, sometimes people commit suicide and family don't either A, accept it, or they just don't believe it. Of course, stigma. Nobody wants to have a family member die of suicide. And insurance issues. Obviously, sometimes insurances don't pay off. There's issues there, and so your report's going to be really scrutinized if you rule it accident versus suicide or vice versa. So there's insurance issues. So you, as an investigator, are going to be dealing with these implications based upon your ruling. But you can't let any of that stuff in your way. You have to simply rule it the way the evidence or the medical findings show. So let's talk about Russian roulette. Let me ask you this question. You think about it to yourself. Russian roulette. Is Russian roulette suicide based upon their actions, or would it be an accident? Obviously, it wouldn't be. I mean, you could make it undetermined, I guess, but it isn't a homicide or a natural, so it's going to be a suicide or an accident in most cases. So what do you think? Suicide, accident? Well, let's look at it. Now, if a person takes a revolver, puts one round in the cylinder, spins the cylinder, cocks it, put it to the head, and pulls the trigger one time, a gun goes off, and he dies. So it could be argued then that it's suicide. And in most places, when I ask that question, the biggest majority of the room will say that it's suicide. And I'll ask why. Why do you think that is suicide? Well, it's inherently dangerous to play Russian roulette. And so knowing the risk, then the person committed the act, that would be suicide. Well, if we have to consider that suicide has to be based upon 70% assurance, okay, let's look at these numbers. Number one, you have to have full investigation. You cannot rule it just based upon one gunshot wound to the head. Was there suicidal comments prior to? Was the person at a party wanting to die? Had he been and played Russian roulette at a party? Had he even mentioned suicidal ideations? Was something going on with him in his life that he had been talking about it or had attempts in the past? Okay. What if he was considerably drunk or high? Does that make a difference? Remember, we have to have someone that voluntarily doesn't act with the intention to die. Okay? That is every definition. That part is in every definition, whether it be name, whether it be all associations have those two things, voluntarily and intentional. So let's consider these percentages. If the revolver is a 5-round cylinder, one bullet in a 5-round cylinder, that's a 20% chance it's going to go off with one trigger squeeze. In a 6-round cylinder, that's a 17% chance, and in a 9-round cylinder, that's 11% chance. So let's say we have a 6-round cylinder, one bullet, one spin, one trigger pull. That's a 17% chance it's going to go off. Are you anywhere near 70? Then you find you're at a party. Let's just say you're at a party, and everybody's talking about the guy was drunk, and he had this revolver, and the people were telling him to put it down, and he was daring people to play Russian roulette. You're a chicken, I'm brave, I'm the best guy here, I've got big cojones, and I'm just that good. And so he empties out all the rounds, puts one in it, spins it, you dare me, I'm tougher than you, click, well, it don't click, it goes boom. Awfully hard to make that a suicide when, number one, you have the percentage of the cylinder issue, but also nothing else about that case you can prove suicide. No other ideations, no negative comments, no I'm going to kill myself, nothing in his past, because you have to do all that. Now you have to think, this Russian roulette is more of an accident than a suicide. because there was not the intent to die. Now, if it's hands of another, let's say that somebody at the party and they put one round in the cylinder, spin it, pull the hammer back and put it to someone's head and pull the trigger and it goes off. That's homicide every day, because that person committed a volition, he committed an act voluntarily to someone else and caused their death. Now, if the prosecutor is going to consider that an accident and not charge, maybe, but that's not up to us. That fits the definition of homicide. That person purposely put a gun to someone's head and pulled the trigger, so he died at the hands of another. That's clear homicide. The reason why I don't believe it's suicide on the other way is because the person didn't have the intent to die. They had the intent to show off. Okay? And if you can't find the intent, you might consider how you'd rule that. So here's another good example. 18 years to die. In 2004, a man was found hanging in his jail cell. And he had made comments about wanting to die. And he had actually was seeing a psychiatrist, a psychologist there in jail. And in fact, a psychologist who is the one that found him came to visit him that morning in his cell and found him hanging. And of course, they cut him down. He got taken to the hospital, and he had suffered traumatic brain injury because he had been without oxygen to his brain long enough that he had traumatic brain injury. Plus, he had a lot of damage and scarring to his esophagus and things that make to where he could not swallow food. So, after he got out of the hospital, he did go back to prison, but on a feeding tube and in a medical ward. And after that, he tried to come home, but he could not physically, mentally, family couldn't take care of him. He went into a nursing home, stayed there for a number of years, went to another nursing home, and this is like 18 years later, his stomach lining got infected, had an ulcer, got infected, and the feeding tube could not be reinserted. They was having issues getting the feeding tube reinserted correctly so that he could actually take in protein, calorie protein. The family chose to go ahead and put him on hospice status and allow him to die. So he actually died of calorie protein deficiency because he could not get nutrients. That case was ruled suicide. Why? Well, it took him 18 years to die. But the act that he did 18 years ago, he purposely hanged himself in his cell to die. Now, the fact that he survives that, and he lasted 1 minute, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 6 months, a year, 18 years, isn't the question. What started a chain of morbid events was when he hanged himself 18 years ago, and those injuries caused him to die 18 years later. Now, that can be applied to a lot of things. Shooting victims, car accident victims, things like that. That can be applied to a lot of things. So what starts a chain of morbid events? And in this case, what started it was he hanging himself, and so it would be considered suicide. Now, most of your cases won't be long months, weeks, or years, but consider that. Suicide has to be based upon the action someone took to kill himself. Now, maybe it's going to take a few weeks for them to die. If they shoot themselves in the head and they don't die right away, and they get taken to the hospital, and then they continue to decline over the matter of hours, and then they're put on a ventilator, and then they're put on full life support, because then they're rendered brain dead, and then they go 2 or 3 days considered being brain dead while transplant service is set up, and they finally then go ahead and the family agrees to organ transplant, and then the person dies. So now the person dies on this day, but the event took place several days later. That's still a suicide, right? Even though he didn't die instantly, he did die. He just had some medical intervention. Now, it took 4 days, 5 days, 6 days rather than 18 years. But the same principle, of course, applies. All right, I think we're going to leave it off there. We'll pick up next time where we left off. I want to remind you, of course, of the online training on the website, also on classroom training. Now, we have a great blood pattern class, 3-day blood pattern class coming up in October in Springfield, Missouri. Of course, we got our week-long MDI course here in Missouri as well. That's every March and October, so that's going to be in October. And then there's several places that I'm going to be around the country in the next few months. Illinois and Iowa and Minnesota. I think I just got back from Kansas, going back up to Nebraska. So there's a lot of training around the country. So if you will go on to the coronertalk.com, click on the Academy link, it'll take you to the Academy, all fresh, brand new website for the Academy. And you can click on training, go to classroom training, and see where I am at around the country and what topics we have being taught. So again, I appreciate you jumping in. I appreciate my listeners so much. I appreciate the emails I get, the comments I get. I love each and every one of you, and I love interacting with you. So until next week, everybody, find a way to be a blessing to someone. Someone in your life deserves a blessing. For sure, in the days we're living in now, we all could use more blessings. Till next week, everybody, be safe.
Thanks for listening to Coroner Talk, a DSPN media production. Visit our website at coronertalk.com. And be sure to like us on Facebook at facebook.com/coronertraining. 3617 1024 scene en route to morgue.